The plain heaves like a breathing beast as 4,000 men cry to Al-Mu'min from under the soil, until iron hooves drum the last air from the grave and the field lies still, a bloodless altar to the lame Lord's promise. In the late summer of the year 1400, the sun hung over the Anatolian plateau like a judgmentala, scorching the earth until it cracked and bled dust, yet for the defenders within the colossal fortress of Shivas, the heat was the least of their terrors. This was a city that believed itself to be the very anvil of God, a sanctuary constructed of black basalt and limestone that had withstood the tides of petty warlords and wandering bandits for centuries, convincing its inhabitants that stone was stronger than fate. The garrison was a teeming mass of 4,000 souls, a mixture of hardened Armenian mercenaries and local levies who spent their days sharpening iron and their nights murmuring prayers into the suffocating dark. They clung to the spiritual architecture of their existence as desperately as they clung to the battlements, invoking the 99 names of the divine to ward off the encroaching silence of the steppes. Among these invocations, the name Al-Mu'min hung heavy in the stagnant air, whispered by lips parched from fear and thirst. The guarantor of safety. The one who grants security. It was a theological shield, a belief that the Almighty provided a sanctuary that no mortal hand could violate, a promise that faith was a fortress far more durable than the mortar holding their walls together. To the outside observer, Shivas was impenetrable, a jagged crown of towers piercing the skyline, surrounded by a moat that reflected the heavens like a dark mirror, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with the copper scent of anxiety and the sour reek of unwashed bodies confined in mail and leather. The sensory experience of the siege began before the first arrow was even knocked, manifesting as a vibration in the soles of the feet, a rhythmic thumping that traveled through the bedrock like the heartbeat of a subterranean leviathan. The soldiers standing watch on the high towers strained their eyes against the shimmering heat haze, looking for the telltale storm clouds of dust that heralded the end of worlds, yet for days there was only the mocking emptiness of the horizon. This waiting was a torture more exquisite than the rack, for it allowed the mind to populate the void with monsters, and the monster they feared had a name that tasted of ash and ruin. They knew who was coming. They knew that the man marching toward them did not merely conquer cities but devoured them whole, leaving behind nothing but pyramids of severed skulls as grisly monuments to his own ego. The illusion of safety provided by the name Al-Mu'min began to fracture not under the impact of a trebuchet, but under the weight of this crushing anticipation. The defenders ran their hands over the cold, rough stone of the parapets, trying to draw strength from the material world, trying to convince themselves that a wall 20 feet thick could stop a force of nature. They checked the granaries, counting sacks of grain one by one, and inspected the cisterns where the water level was dangerously low, engaging in the mundane rituals of survival to distract themselves from the approaching apocalypse. The priests and imams walked the perimeter, their chants fighting a losing battle against the rising wind, their voices trembling as they assured the men that they were the righteous, that the guarantor of safety would not allow the heathen tide to wash over the faithful. But faith is a fragile thing when the earth itself begins to tremble. It started as a low rumble, a sound felt in the chest cavity rather than heard with the ears, growing steadily louder until the tea in their cups rippled and the dust danced upon the flagstones. The horizon, once clear and empty, began to darken, not with rain, but with a living darkness, a swarm of cavalry so vast it drank the rivers dry and trampled the grass into oblivion. The men of Shivas griped their spears with knuckles white as bone, watching as the shadow of the lame one finally fell upon their world, and in that terrifying moment, the stone walls of their fortress suddenly felt as thin as parchment. The arrival of the Timurid horde did not resemble the approach of a human army so much as it resembled the onset of a geological cataclysm, a living tide that flooded the valley until the earth itself seemed to disappear beneath a carpet of iron and horsehair. From the high battlements of Shivas, the defenders watched in paralyzed silence as the landscape was rewritten by the will of one man, the green fields turned into a churning sea of mud and tents that stretched to the very edges of perception. 140,000 soldiers, a number so vast it defied the comprehension of the medieval mind, encamped around the city with a discipline that was more terrifying than their ferocity, moving with the synchronized lethality of a single, predatory organism. At the center of this storm sat Timur, known to the west as Tamerlane and to his enemies as the Lord of the Conjunction, a figure who had carved a path of skulls from Delhi to Damascus. He was an old man by the standards of the year 1400, nearly 65, his body ravaged by the old wounds that had earned him the moniker Timur-i-Lang, or Timur the Lame, dragging a leg stiffened by an arrow and possessing an arm that could no longer lift a sword. Yet, as he surveyed the walls of Shivas from his saddle, his physical infirmity only served to amplify the horror of his presence. He was a mind pure and sharp, a strategic genius who no longer needed to swing a blade because he commanded 100,000 others to kill in his stead. The noise of the encampment alone was a weapon of war, a relentless, dissonant drone that denied the defenders of Shivas a single moment of peace or sleep. The air was thick with the guttural roar of camels, the sharp whinnying of steppes ponies, and the terrifying, alien trumpeting of Indian war elephants, beasts of burden and slaughter that Timur had dragged from the burning ruins of Delhi to the highlands of Anatolia. These grey mountains of flesh, clad in chainmail and carrying archers upon their backs, stood as impossible monsters to the Armenian garrison, living proof that their enemy possessed the power to bend the natural world to his desire. The defenders gripped their rosaries and looked down at the sheer scale of the logistical machinery arrayed against them, realizing with a sinking dread that their stone walls were not a protection, but a prison. Timur did not rush the gates with the foolish impetuosity of a younger warlord. He was a master of the siege, a conductor of an orchestra of destruction who understood that stone, no matter how thick, has a breaking point. He unleashed his engineers, the unsung architects of ruin, who swarmed toward the moat not with swords, but with picks, spades, and timber, beginning the slow, methodical process of dissection. Beneath the blistering sun, the siege engines began to rise like skeletal giants, trebuchets and mangonels assembled with practiced efficiency, their counterweights groaning as they hurled boulders the size of men into the city, smashing rooftops and crushing bones with indifferent gravity. But the true terror was not what flew through the air, but what crawled beneath the earth. Timur's sappers, men who lived their lives in the dark claustrophobia of tunnels, began to burrow under the foundations of the great towers, digging like grave worms to hollow out the earth that held Shivas upright. The defenders could hear it in the dead of night, a faint, rhythmic scratching beneath the floors, a scratching that grew louder and more persistent with every passing hour. It was the sound of their own inevitable collapse, the sound of the structural integrity of their world being stripped away spoonful by spoonful. They tried to countermine, digging their own desperate tunnels to intercept the enemy, engaging in brutal, suffocating skirmishes in the pitch black where men stabbed at sounds and strangled each other in the mud, but the Timurid sappers were relentless, driving their galleries deeper, shoring them up with wooden props that were soaked in naphtha and pig fat, ready to be set alight to collapse the walls above. The psychological weight of the siege pressed down upon Shivas with a force greater than gravity. The name of Al-Mu'min was still on their lips, but the conviction in their hearts was being eroded by the undeniable reality of the lame Lord's power. They had heard the stories of what happened to those who resisted, the towers of heads cemented with mortar, the cities razed until barley could be planted in their streets, and those stories curdled their blood. Timur played upon this fear like a virtuoso, ordering his musicians to play great copper drums and horns throughout the night, a cacophony that vibrated in the teeth of the defenders and kept their nerves stretched to the snapping point. He was demonstrating to them that he controlled their environment completely, he controlled the light with the smoke of his fires, he controlled the sound with his drums, and soon, he would control the very ground they stood upon. By the end of the second week, the great towers of Shivas, which had stood for centuries as immutable facts of the landscape, began to list. The mining operations had succeeded, the wooden props beneath the foundations were burned, the earth gave way, and the stone cracked with a sound like a thunderclap that stopped the hearts of all who heard it. A breach opened, a jagged wound in the city's armor, but Timur did not order the assault immediately. He paused. He let the dust settle. He let the defenders stare into the gaping maw of their own vulnerability, letting the silence stretch out until it was more unbearable than the noise. He knew that a city taken by storm costs blood and treasure, but a city that surrenders is a prize taken whole. He waited for the terror to ripen, watching from his pavilion with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, knowing that the men inside were no longer fighting him, but fighting the creeping, icy realization that their God had gone silent and the devil was waiting at the door. The visual of the leaning tower, held up only by precarious rubble, became a symbol of their doom, a physical manifestation that the guarantor of safety had stepped aside, leaving them naked before the scourge of God. The silence that descended upon the battered walls of Shivas was, in many ways, far more terrifying than the cacophony of war that had preceded it. For weeks, the acoustic reality of the city had been a nightmare soundscape of splintering stone, the wet thud of arrows finding flesh, and the incessant, maddening drums of the Timurid army, but now, as the dust from the collapsed tower slowly settled like a shroud over the defenders, the world fell into a hush that felt heavy with omen. The breach was there, a gaping, jagged wound in the masonry that exposed the soft entrails of the city to the wolves waiting outside, yet the final killing blow did not come. The Armenian mercenaries and the exhausted local levies stood amidst the rubble, their chests heaving, their faces masked in grey dust and dried sweat, gripping their notched swords with trembling hands as they waited for the inevitable scream of the charge. But the charge did not materialize. Instead, the great ocean of the Tatar horde parted with an eerie, disciplined fluidity, and from the ranks of the tens of thousands of horsemen emerged not a shock troop of executioners, but a small, solitary party of envoys riding under a banner of truce. It was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation, a sudden shift from the brutal language of violence to the civilized whisper of diplomacy, designed to disorient a garrison that had already made its peace with death. Timur the Lame was not merely a butcher, he was a student of the human soul, and he understood that while men will fight like demons when backed into a corner, they will fold like wet paper if offered a glimmer of hope. The envoys approached the ruined gates, their horses stepping high over the debris of the siege, their demeanor calm and almost pitying, as if they were disappointed that it had come to this. They called out to the commander of the garrison, their voices carrying clearly in the stagnant, hot air, offering terms that seemed too generous to be real, yet too seductive to ignore. The Lord of the Conjunction, they proclaimed, admired the courage of the defenders, he saw their tenacity, their refusal to bow before the storm, and he wished to spare such valiant warriors from the total annihilation that would surely follow if the assault was ordered. The proposal was simple, a transaction of survival: surrender the city, open the gates, and lay down your arms, and in exchange, you shall be granted the mercy of the conqueror. It was here, in the shadow of their own destruction, that the trap was baited not with gold or land, but with the sacred weight of a promise. The defenders of Shivas were men of the sword, but they were also men of the book, raised in a world where an oath sworn before the Almighty was the ironclad currency of truth. They listened as the lead envoy raised his voice to the heavens and spoke the words that would seal their fate, a precise and carefully constructed sentence that would echo through history as the ultimate testament to the devil's cunning. My Lord Timur swears by the Creator of all things, by the sanctity of the Quran, and by the very name of God, that if you surrender now, no drop of your blood shall be shed. The phrase hung in the air, glittering with the promise of salvation. No drop of your blood shall be shed. To the desperate men on the walls, whose lips were cracked from thirst and whose minds were fraying at the edges, this was the intervention they had prayed for. They thought of Al-Mu'min, the guarantor of safety, believing that their prayers had been answered, that the divine had softened the heart of the beast and provided a sanctuary in the midst of hell. They looked at the breach, where the enemy could pour in like water, and then they looked at the envoy, who offered them life. The calculation was agonizing but swift. On one side lay certain death, the rape of their city, and the enslavement of their families, on the other lay the word of a king who had sworn a holy oath. Inside the command tent, the debate was fierce and desperate, a collision of pragmatism and paranoia. The commanders argued that Timur was a monster, a man who had built towers of skulls in Isfahan and Delhi, a creature who knew no honor. But the counter-argument was fueled by the irresistible instinct for self-preservation. He has sworn by God, they whispered, trying to convince themselves as much as each other. No man, not even the lame one, would dare invite the wrath of heaven by breaking an oath sworn so publicly. They dissected the theology of the promise, convincing themselves that the sanctity of the vow was a shield stronger than their ruined walls. They told themselves that Timur needed Shiva's intact, that he needed their manpower for his coming war against the Ottoman Sultan, that logic dictated mercy. They were projecting their own morality onto a man who operated on a plane of cruelty they could not comprehend, failing to see that the devil does not break his contracts, he simply reads the fine print that you were too blind to notice. The hope of Al-Mu'min blinded them to the reality of the predator standing at their gate. And so, the order was given. The heavy timber bars, scarred by the siege, were lifted from the gates with a groan that sounded like the mourning of the city itself. The iron hinges shrieked as the great doors swung outward, revealing the blinding light of the Anatolian sun and the waiting masses of the Timurid army. The 4,000 defenders of Shiva's marched out, not as conquered slaves, but with a shred of dignity, believing they had secured an honorable capitulation. They laid their weapons in a great pile, swords that had been passed down through generations, shields battered by maces, bows unstrung, and stepped away, stripped of their metal shells, standing vulnerable in their tunics and trousers. They walked into the open plain, expecting to be disarmed and perhaps levied into Timur's army, or held for ransom. The air smelled of horse sweat and dry grass, and for a moment, as the wind cooled their fevered skin, they allowed themselves to feel the relief of the survivor. They looked into the faces of the Tatar horsemen who ringed them, looking for signs of camaraderie or at least professional respect, but they found only blank, impassive stares. The eyes of the enemy did not hold the look of men greeting surrendered foes, they held the look of wolves watching a flock of sheep pen itself in. The atmosphere began to shift imperceptibly at first, then with a crushing rapidity. The relief of surrender curdled into a cold, knotting dread in the stomachs of the Armenians. They noticed that they were being corralled, herded towards a specific patch of ground where the earth had been strangely disturbed, where the grass had been trampled and the soil turned. Timur sat upon his portable throne a short distance away, watching the procession with the stillness of a viper, his crippled hand resting on his knee, his eyes unblinking. He did not speak to them. He did not welcome them. He merely watched as 4,000 men, the flower of Shiva's defense, were surrounded by a wall of cavalry that grew tighter with every passing second. The silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of diplomacy, it was the suffocating, electric silence of the executioner raising the axe. The defenders looked at one another, the realization dawning in their eyes, a collective gasp of horror as they understood that the interpretation of the oath was not what they had assumed. They had trusted in the spirit of the word, but they had surrendered to a man who worshipped only the letter. The guarantor of safety had not saved them. He had merely been the bait for the trap. The sun beat down on their unprotected heads, and the shadow of the lame one stretched long and dark across the field, swallowing them whole before the first blow was even struck. The sun at its zenith in the Anatolian summer is not merely a source of light but a physical weight, a hammer of gold that beats upon the anvil of the earth until the air itself shimmers with a delirium of heat, and under this oppressive celestial gaze, the 4,000 defenders of Shiva stood stripped of their iron skins, waiting for a judgment that had already been decided in the dark recesses of a conqueror's mind. They had walked out of the city gates as men of war, surrendering with the heavy hearts of soldiers who have traded pride for survival, but as they stood herded together in the open plain, the psychological architecture of their reality began to crumble, replaced by a primal, vibrating anxiety that tasted of copper and dry dust. They were surrounded by the Timurid cavalry, a ring of steel and horseflesh that tightened with agonizing slowness, the riders sitting motionless in their saddles, their faces obscured by helms and veils, looking down at the disarmed Armenians with the dispassionate curiosity of scientists observing insects in a jar. There was no jeering, no taunts of victory, no clashing of swords against shields, there was only the terrible, suffocating silence of the steppe, broken only by the snorting of horses and the rustle of the wind through the dry grass, a silence that amplified the beating of 4,000 hearts into a collective drumroll of panic. The defenders looked toward the pavilion where Timur sat, the lame lord enthroned upon a dais of carpets, his crippled legs stretched out before him, his eyes scanning the ranks of the surrendered with a gaze that was devoid of malice yet entirely stripped of mercy, a gaze that saw not human beings but variables in a complex equation of terror that he was about to solve. The expectation among the Armenians was grim but conventional. they anticipated the sword, the quick and brutal mercy of the blade, or perhaps the degradation of chains and the long, sorrowful march to the slave markets of Samarkand. They had prepared their souls for the sharp bite of steel, whispering their final acts of contrition, making their peace with Al-Mu'min, believing that if they were to die, it would be a death of blood and iron, a soldier's death, however ignoble. But the order that finally came from the dais did not summon the executioners, nor did it unleash the swordsmen who sat with their hands resting casually on the hilts of their curved sabers. Instead, a signal was given, a subtle motion of the conqueror's hand that brought forth a different kind of battalion, a regiment of men clad in the rough, soiled tunics of laborers, carrying not the instruments of war, but the tools of creation and burial, heavy iron spades, pickaxes with tips dulled by stone, and woven baskets for hauling earth. A ripple of confusion passed through the huddled mass of defenders, a murmuring wave of bewilderment that momentarily eclipsed their fear, for the mind struggles to comprehend the anomalous, and the sight of construction crews on a killing field was a grotesque absurdity that defied the logic of warfare. They watched, squinting against the glare, as these laborers advanced not toward the city walls to repair the breach, but toward the open ground directly in front of the captives, where they began to break the hard-packed soil with a rhythmic, synchronized violence. The sound of metal striking earth is a dull, thudding noise, a sound usually associated with the planting of crops or the laying of foundations, a sound of life and future, but here, under the shadow of the black banner, it took on a sinister, hollow quality that chilled the blood of every man who heard it. The engineers worked with a terrifying efficiency, the product of a lifetime spent dissecting cities and reshaping geography to the whim of their master, and slowly, horrifyingly, the shape of their labor began to emerge from the dust. They were not digging latrines, nor were they digging fortifications, they were digging trenches, deep and wide, geometric scars in the fabric of the plain that were too large for irrigation and too precise for refuse. The realization did not hit the defenders all at once, but rather it crept over them like a frost, a slow dawning horror that started in the gut and worked its way up to the throat as they watched the pits deepen, foot by foot, yard by yard. The dimensions were calculatingly specific, measured to accommodate a volume of matter that roughly equaled the mass of the 4,000 men standing nearby, a mathematical correspondence that turned the stomach and made the knees weak. It was then that the memory of the oath returned to them, crashing into their consciousness with the force of a physical blow, the words of the envoy replaying in their minds with a new, demonic clarity, "No drop of your blood shall be shed." The theological trap snapped shut with a deafening metaphysical clang, revealing the hideous genius of Timur's cruelty, a cruelty that did not merely destroy the body but mocked the soul and the very nature of truth. The defenders realized, with a vertigo that made the world spin, that they were not dealing with a liar, but with a supreme legalist, a monster who adhered to the strict, literal interpretation of his word while violating every tenet of its spirit. He had sworn by the Creator that he would not spill their blood, and he intended to keep that promise with a fastidious, terrifying exactitude. To strike a man with a sword is to spill blood, to pierce him with an arrow is to spill blood, even to strangle him might bruise the flesh and risk the forbidden stain. But the earth? The earth leaves no stain. To return a man to the dust from which he was made, to encase him in the darkness of the soil, is a bloodless act, a pristine execution that adheres to the contract while delivering a death infinitely more horrific than the blade. The concept of Al-Mu'min, the guarantor of safety, was twisted into a grotesque parody, for the earth is indeed a sanctuary, a place of eternal safety where no enemy can reach you, provided you are dead. The panic that erupted within the corral of the condemned was not the frenzied chaos of battle, but the desperate, bleeding terror of a flock that smells the slaughterhouse, a writhing contraction of humanity as men recoiled from the gaping maws of the trenches that waited for them. But they were unarmed, stripped of their steel, clad only in cloth and flesh, surrounded by a wall of armored horsemen who watched their realization with stone-faced indifference. The Tatar guards tightened the circle, their horses stepping closer, pushing the outer ranks of the Armenians inward, compressing the mass of bodies until breath became difficult, using the sheer weight of their mounts to stifle any thought of resistance. There was no escape, no direction to run that did not lead to the spear point or the hoof, and the sheer hopelessness of their position began to break their minds before the earth even touched them. Men fell to their knees, not in prayer, but in the paralysis of total despair, their eyes fixed on the black dirt piling up beside the trenches, that rich, dark anatomical soil of Anatolia that was destined to become their shroud. Timur watched it all, his face a mask of philosophical detachment, likely contemplating the lesson he was writing upon the pages of history, a lesson about the foolishness of trusting in the mercy of kings who view themselves as the scourge of God. He signaled again, and the laborers set down their spades and picked up ropes, distinct, rough-hewn coils of hemp that smelled of tar and harsh fibers. The time for digging was done, the time for binding had arrived. The method was to be systematic, industrial in its scale, the defenders were to be trussed like livestock, their knees bent against their chests, their heads forced down, compacted into shapes that would fit efficiently into the puzzle of the grave. The soldiers of the horde moved in now, dismounting to assist the laborers, grabbing the Armenian mercenaries, men who had once stood proud on the battlements, men who had fathers and sons and stories, and wrestling them into submission not with the dignity of combat, but with the rough handling of butchers preparing meat. The air filled with the sounds of struggle, the grunts of exertion, the sobbing of grown men who had seen the face of the abyss and found it staring back with a smile of legalistic irony. This was the unlocking of hell, not a fiery inferno of demons and pitchforks, but a cold, bureaucratic hell of technicalities and loopholes, where a man's life was extinguished because of a semantic trick, a play on words that turned a holy oath into a death sentence. The atmosphere was thick with the grotesque absurdity of it all, the sheer madness of adhering to a promise of non-violence while preparing to commit an atrocity of biblical proportions. The defenders looked at the sky, that vast, indifferent blue vault that stretched over Shivas, searching for Al-Mu'min, searching for the intervention that had been promised in the prayers, but they found only the circling carrion birds, who had gathered in anticipation of a feast that would never come, for the earth was jealous and would swallow the meal whole. The heat seemed to intensify, baking the scene into a tableau of suffering, burning the image of the trenches into the retinas of the survivors, ensuring that in the final moments before the darkness took them, the last thing they would see was not the face of God, but the freshly turned soil of their own oblivion. The deception was complete, the sanctuary was a tomb, and the guarantor of safety was the architect of their suffocation. The descent into the abyss began not with a scream, but with the dry, rasping sound of hemp ropes being tightened against resisting muscle, a friction that burned the skin and sealed the fate of the garrison with a finality that iron fetters could never possess. The 4,000 men of Shivas, once the proud guardians of the stone towers, were now reduced to a writhing, chaotic mass of bound humanity, their elbows wrenched behind their backs until the ligaments groaned in protest, their ankles lashed together with a cruelty that rendered them as helpless as infants. The sun, now past its zenith but burning with a renewed, spiteful intensity, beat down upon the scene, turning the dust of the plain into a choking fog that coated the throats of the condemned, mixing with the sweat of terror to form a mud that caked their faces like death masks before they had even ceased to breathe. There was a sickening intimacy to the violence. The Timurid soldiers, men of the steppe who lived by the horse and the bow, moved among the captives with the heavy, sweating labor of stevedores loading a cargo of flesh, their boots kicking at shins, their rough hands shoving heads down, forcing the Armenians into a kneeling posture that mimicked prayer but served only the logistics of slaughter. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, the acrid tang of urine released in fear, and the overwhelming, copper scent of impending violence that seems to exude from the pores of men who know their end has come. It was a tableau of industrial-scale misery, a production line of death where the raw material was human life and the finished product was a patch of leveled earth. As the first wave of prisoners was shoved toward the lip of the trenches, a collective wail rose from the center of the crowd, a sound so primal and full of despair that it seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the bones of those who heard it, yet it was cut short by the ruthless efficiency of the guards who struck out with the shafts of their spears, not to kill, but to silence, for the order was to bury the living, not the dead. The trenches themselves were deep, dark gashes in the Anatolian soil, dug with the precision of graves but the dimensions of mass pits, their bottoms obscured by shadow, waiting like hungry mouths. The first men to go over the edge did not fall with dignity, they were toppled, pushed like sacks of grain, tumbling into the darkness in a tangle of limbs and ropes, landing with heavy, wet thuds upon the hard earth below. One man fell upon another, a chaotic heap of groaning humanity, ribs cracking under the impact, faces pressed into the dirt, the breath driven from their lungs by the weight of their comrades falling from the sky above them. There was no room to move, no leverage to stand, only the crushing panic of being at the bottom of a well made of flesh, looking up at the rectangle of blinding blue sky that was rapidly being obscured by the silhouettes of the executioners. Then came the sound that would haunt the nightmares of every witness for the remainder of their days, the sound of the first shovel of earth hitting a human body. It was a soft, scattering noise, like rain falling on dry leaves, a whisper of soil that seemed innocuous at first, almost gentle. But then came the second, and the third, and the 100th. The engineers, standing along the ridge of the excavation, began their work in earnest, their spades biting into the mounds of loose dirt and flinging it into the pits with a rhythmic, tireless cadence. The dust rose in a suffocating cloud, coating the eyes and filling the screaming mouths of the men below. The horror of the situation was its slow, grinding inevitability. This was not the swift decapitation of the sword, which takes a life in the blink of an eye, nor was it the chaotic tearing of the arrow. This was a drowning in dry matter, a gradual, inch-by-inch erasure of the self. The soil filled the spaces between the bodies, weighing down the clothes, creeping into the ears, pressing against the eyelids, heavy and implacable. The men at the bottom screamed, but their cries were muffled by the dirt accumulating in their throats, their struggles becoming weaker as the weight of the earth, and the weight of the men layered above them, pinned them to the ground with the force of a geological stratum. Timur the Lame sat upon his dais, a motionless idol of cruelty, watching the proceedings with an expression of intense, almost scholarly concentration. To him, this was not merely an execution, it was the fulfillment of a legal contract, a demonstration of his supreme adherence to the letter of the law. He had sworn by the Creator, by the 99 names of God, that no blood would be shed, and he was keeping that oath with a terrifying, perverse fidelity. He watched as the brown earth swallowed the colorful tunics of the Armenians, watching as the distinct individuals, fathers, sons, brothers, were merged into a single, undifferentiated mass of matter. He saw the logic of the grave, the ultimate equality of the soil, and in his mind, he was not a monster, but an agent of destiny, a man who had found the loophole in the divine code. He was Al-Mu'min's shadow, the dark reflection of security, proving that safety is a relative concept and that the only true sanctuary from the wrath of a conqueror is the oblivion of the void. The irony was a bitter poison. The defenders had surrendered to save their lives, invoking the name of the faithful one, and now that very faith was being used to bury them, their prayers turning to dust in their mouths quite literally. As the trenches filled, the nature of the horror shifted from the visual to the auditory and the tactile. The men in the upper layers of the pit, those who had been thrown in last, fought with the desperation of drowning rats, scrambling over the bodies of their suffocating comrades, trying to claw their way up the loose, shifting slopes of the grave. But the sides were too steep, and the earth too soft, and for every foot they gained, the relentless spades of the Timurid engineers sent them sliding back down in an avalanche of dirt and despair. The guards stood at the perimeter, using their spear butts to push back any hand that managed to reach the surface, denying even a moment's respite. The noise from the pit changed from screams to a low, muffled groaning, a subterranean vibration of thousands of lungs fighting for air, of thousands of hearts beating in the frantic rhythm of hypoxia. It was the sound of the earth itself in pain, a deep, resonant hum of suffering that traveled through the ground and up through the boots of the executioners, making their own hands shake as they worked. Even the hardened soldiers of the steppe, men who had seen cities burn and pyramids of skulls rise in the sun, looked away, their faces pale beneath their dark tans, unsettled by the sheer, cold-blooded magnitude of this bloodless slaughter. To kill with a sword is an act of passion, of martial fury. To bury 4,000 men alive is an act of engineering, a cold, administrative disposal of human waste that stripped the act of killing of any warrior's honor. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, bruised shadows across the plain of Shivas, and still the shovels did not stop. The level of the earth rose, covering the boots, then the waists, then the chests of the topmost layer of victims. The visual horror was now one of fragmentation, a hand reaching out from the soil, grasping at the empty air, a face upturned to the sky, eyes wide and white with madness, before a shovel of dirt extinguished the light forever, a knee protruding from the ground like a broken root. The air was heavy with the dust of the grave, a dry, choking powder that tasted of minerals and death. The defenders were no longer men, they were becoming part of the landscape, their bodies serving as the aggregate in a concrete of flesh and soil. The psychological toll on the victims was beyond the capacity of language to articulate, the claustrophobia, the crushing weight, the utter darkness that descended even before death arrived. They were being returned to the clay from which Adam was made, but they were being returned conscious, aware, and terrified, denied the mercy of unconsciousness until the carbon dioxide finally flooded their brains and shut down the lights of the soul. And yet, the most horrific aspect of the burial was not the death itself, but the movement that continued long after the surface had been leveled. As the engineers finished their grim task, smoothing the earth over the trenches until the scars in the plain were filled, the ground refused to be still. The soil heaved and rippled, a grotesque, undulating motion caused by the thrashing struggles of the thousands of men buried beneath. It was as if the earth was breathing, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction that betrayed the lingering life below. The newly turned field was alive, a monstrous, restless entity that groaned and shifted under the twilight sky. The visual was maddening, the solid ground, the foundation of all reality, had become liquid with the agony of the buried. It was a sight that defied the laws of nature, a violation of the sanctity of the earth, a testament to a suffering so vast that it could not be contained even by 6 feet of heavy soil. The Timurid soldiers pulled back, fearful of this living graveyard, making signs against the evil eye, whispering that the jinn had taken the field. But Timur did not pull back. He ordered his cavalry, the heavy lancers on their armored destriers, to ride back and forth over the fresh graves. The ground was soft, and the horses sank to their fetlocks, their hooves stamping down the loose earth, compressing the soil, crushing the pockets of air that kept the men below alive. The rhythmic thudding of thousands of hooves acted as a terrible lullaby, a mechanical compactor that silenced the heaving earth. The vibration of the horses traveled down into the dark, vibrating through the ribs of the dying, a final message from the world above that they had been utterly forsaken. The sounds from below grew fainter, the movement of the earth grew sluggish, until finally, as the first stars began to prick the velvet canopy of the night, the ground ceased to move. The heaving stopped. The groans were silenced. The field of Shivas lay flat and still, a seamless expanse of turned earth that held within its belly a garrison of 4,000 souls, preserved in the darkness, their blood unshed, their lungs filled with dust, their faith in the guarantor of safety answered with the eternal security of the tomb. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, accusing silence that seemed to ring louder than the drums of war, a silence that signaled the completion of the lame Lord's masterpiece of horror. The oath was kept. The city was taken. And the dead were gone, vanished into the earth without a single drop of crimson to stain the conscience of the conqueror. The moon that rose over the plain of Shivas on that night in the year 1400 was not the comforting, silver orb that poets praise, but a pale, sickly witness that cast a corpse light over a landscape transformed into a charnel house of the invisible. The heaving of the earth had finally ceased, the subterranean struggle of 4,000 suffocating men having given way to the dense, heavy inertia of death, leaving the field flat and deceptively serene, save for the hoofprints of the Tatar heavy cavalry which were stamped into the soil like the seals of a demonic contract. To the casual eye, the ground appeared merely as a freshly plowed field, a vast rectangle of overturned dark earth that smelled of damp clay and crushed roots, but to the mind that knew the secret of what lay beneath, it was a screaming abomination, a texture of reality so wrong that it seemed to warp the very air above it. The silence that now draped the valley was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a void, a suffocating blanket of quietude that felt heavy on the eardrums, distinct from the stillness of sleep or the peace of the night. It was the specific, heavy silence of the mass grave, a silence that possessed a physical density, pressing against the tent flaps of the Timurid encampment and creeping into the dreams of the soldiers who had wielded the spades. Even the horses, beasts usually indifferent to the affairs of men, seemed spooked by the patch of earth, rolling their eyes and stamping their hooves, refusing to graze near the perimeter of the burial site, as if they could sense the vibrations of the souls that had been pressed into the bedrock. Inside the city of Shivas, the cessation of the siege brought no relief, only a paralysis of terror that was colder and sharper than the winter wind. The civilians, the merchants, the weavers, the mothers clutching infants, the old men who remembered the days of peace, had watched from the high walls as their defenders were marched out, and they had watched as the earth swallowed them whole. They had seen the guarantee of safety, the holy name of Al-Mu'min, twisted into a knot that strangled their hope, and now they waited in the darkness of their homes, blowing out their lamps, praying to a God they feared had abandoned them to the logic of the devil. The gates stood open, the hinges broken, a gaping mouth that invited the predator inside, but the predator did not rush. Timur, satisfied with the fulfillment of his oath, allowed the terror to marinate, allowed the imagination of the populace to inflict a torture far more exquisite than any knife. He knew that a city conquered by fear is a city that does not rebel, a city that offers up its wealth and its children with trembling hands, desperate to avoid the fate of the buried. The night passed in an agony of anticipation, every creak of a floorboard sounding like the footfall of a doom that had already arrived. When the dawn finally broke, it bled across the sky in streaks of violet and bruised orange, illuminating the devastation with a harsh, unforgiving light. The Timurid army, a machine of consumption that had stripped the surrounding countryside of every grain of wheat and every blade of grass, turned its hungering gaze toward the stone carcass of the city itself. The sacking of Shivas was not the frenzied, chaotic looting of an undisciplined mob, but the systematic dismantling of a society by a force that understood the economics of destruction. The soldiers entered the city not with a roar, but with the grim purpose of harvesters entering a field of ripe corn. They moved from house to house, from street to street, extracting the wealth of generations, the silver candlesticks, the silk carpets, the hidden caches of gold coins, with a ruthless efficiency. But the true wealth of Shivas was not in its metal, but in its flesh. The population, stripped of their defenders who now slept in the suffocating embrace of the trench, were herded into the squares, divided like cattle into those who could work, those who could be sold, and those who were merely mouths to feed. The young and the strong were bound in chains, destined for the long, sorrowful march to Samarkand, to build the monuments of the man who had destroyed their world, forcing them to construct beauty upon a foundation of their own grief. Timur himself rode through the gates of Shivas on a white charger, his crippled leg resting stiffly in the stirrup, his face a mask of inscrutable calm. He did not look at the weeping women or the men begging for mercy, his gaze was fixed on the architecture, on the physical permanence of the place he had conquered. He ordered the demolition of the fortress walls, the very walls that the defenders had trusted to keep them safe. The engineers, the same men who had dug the pits the day before, now turned their picks against the stone, pulling down the towers block by block, erasing the skyline of the city as surely as they had erased its garrison. The sound of crumbling masonry joined the wailing of the captives, a symphony of erasure that echoed off the surrounding hills. The lame lord decreed that nothing should remain of the defenses, that Shivas should be left naked and broken, a warning to any other city in Anatolia that might dream of resistance. He was rewriting the map, proving that stone is transient and that the only permanent thing in the world is the will of the conqueror. As he rode past the great mosques and churches, he offered no prayers, for in his mind, he was the instrument of God's wrath, the scourge sent to punish the wicked, and his actions were sanctified by his own success. But the most haunting legacy of Shivas was not the ruined walls or the enslaved population, it was the field of the buried. As the days turned into weeks and the Timurid horde finally packed their tents to move westward, like a swarm of locusts seeking new pastures, the grave remained. The earth, settled and packed hard by the sun, began to crack, forming a network of fissures that looked like the veins of a dead giant. The locals who remained, the useless eaters left behind in the ruins, spoke in hushed tones of the sounds that came from that field in the dead of night. They whispered of a low moaning carried on the wind, of the ground trembling when the moon was full, of the grass that eventually grew there being a dark, unnatural shade of green, nourished by the decay of 4,000 men who had been planted like seeds of sorrow. They called it the Black Burying, a cursed patch of geography where no shepherd would graze his flock and no traveler would pitch his tent. The name Al-Mu'min was never spoken in that valley again without a shudder, for the survivors had learned the bitterest lesson of history, that safety is a fragile illusion, and that when a tyrant speaks of peace and swears by the name of God, he is often preparing the spade to dig your grave. The wind that blows over the Anatolian plateau is an ancient wind, carrying the dust of empires that have risen and fallen, but when it passes over the ruins of Shivas, it seems to carry a specific weight, a heaviness that tugs at the soul. It whistles through the cracks in the broken stones, sounding like the breath of men gasping for air in the dark. The story of the 4,000 Armenian defenders became a legend, a grim bedtime story told to children to warn them of the dangers of trust. It stood as a testament to the terrifying genius of Timur, a man who conquered not just with the sword, but with the mind, who turned the virtues of his enemies, their faith, their honor, their belief in the sanctity of an oath, into the weapons of their own destruction. The city of Shivas eventually rose again, as cities do, built upon the layers of rubble and bone, but the scar remained on the psyche of the land. The field where the garrison lies is still there, beneath the modern soil, a hidden stratum of history where the skeleton of a soldier still clutches the phantom of a sword, eternally waiting for the heir that will never come. In the end, the shock of Shivas was not the violence, for violence is the common currency of the world, but the betrayal of the metaphysical order. It was the revelation that the divine name could be used as the mechanism of a trap, that the letter of the law could be used to murder the spirit of life. Timur the Lame rode on to defeat the Ottoman Sultan, to capture kings and humble empires, to die on the road to China, leaving behind a legacy of blood and beauty, but nowhere was his dark genius more perfectly distilled than in the silence of that field in the year 1400. There, he proved that the most terrifying weapon in the arsenal of a warlord is not the trebuchet or the lance, but the twisted promise. The 4,000 men who invoked Al-Mu'min found their security not in the fortress of stone, nor in the mercy of man, but in the indistinguishable, suffocating unity of the earth, a sanctuary from which they would never be evicted, safe forever from the turning of the wheel of fortune, granted the ultimate, terrible security of the dead.